Taxes are an important source of revenue for the government. However, taxes decrease both supply and demand in the market because buyers have to pay a higher price and sellers receive a lower price for their product. Sometimes the government tries to divide the burden of this tax. Tax incidence, however, is the manner in which the burden of a tax is distributed among economic units, namely consumers and producers. In other words, which party carries the actual burden of the tax is known as tax incidence. So the actual burden cannot be mandated by law, but it depends on the respective elasticities of both supply and demand on the tax products. To better see how the elasticity of supply and demand affects tax incidence, let us illustrate through graphs. Now, as we have studied before, there are different kinds of or different degrees of elasticity in demand and supply. We have elastic demand, perfectly inelastic demand, and unitary elastic demand. And the same applies for supply. So let's try to look into all these scenarios and how tax incident changes among parties, namely the consumers and producers, for each of these scenarios is important for us to know. So first, let's look at inelastic demand. So inelastic demand means when the price increases, the quantity demanded would not increase as much. So if there is a large increase in price, there will be a small decrease in quantity. So in inelastic demand, you will have the demand curve. This would be the demand curve, and supply curve before tax S, and you have supply curve after tax ST. So the initial equilibrium was, this is exactly the same how we discussed for our previous video on how we calculated the consumer surplus and producer surplus when there is a tax imposed. It's exactly the same, but we saw the example of unitary demand and supply in the previous video. So now let's actually look into when it is inelastic demand. So this would be price and quantity, and this would be PE, equilibrium, and Q. I'll put it as P and Q. And after the tax has been imposed, now this price, there is a higher price PT, it's QT. Because it is inelastic demand, you have seen there is a rather a big rise in price, but there is not so much decrease in demand. The important part is that during PT, the producers are actually receiving this price. I'll put it as P dash. They are receiving P dash. So if you see the tax burden here, the consumers are going to bear the burden PT minus P, and the government revenue for that one would be PT minus P into QT would be the consumer's burden for the government revenue, and this would be the tax incidence. So you will see this would be consumers, I'll put this as TI, tax incidence, and the small incidence would be for producers. So the conclusion here is that for inelastic demand, the consumer's tax incidence would be greater than producers' tax incidence. Now, inelastic demand, such products like cigarettes and alcohol, because there are not many substitutes, when there is a tax being imposed, you would see that the consumers would be sharing the burden. It will be transferred, the majority of the burden, to the consumers, and they would be paying the price because it is inelastic demand. Now, let's look at the elastic demand and how tax incidence or how the burden is shared between the producer and the consumer. So if it is an elastic demand, still downward sloping D, supply curve should be parallel ST. So this would be P, PT, P dash, and this would be Q and QT. There is a small increase in price, but there is a larger decrease in quantity demanded, which is an elastic demand. So here we can see that the tax burden, if you see, the consumers share less of the burden and the producers share the majority of the burden here, because P minus P dash, if you see, it's larger than PT minus P. So here for elastic demand, the consumers tax incidence would be smaller than producers tax incidence. Now, for example, milk powder is being imported, and if there is an excise duty for importing milk powder, and there are local producers who can produce milk powder locally, and there wouldn't be any taxes for locally produced milk powder. In this case, it is an elastic demand because you can find substitutes for the imported milk powder as local milk powder. You can find the substitutes there. So when there is a tax being imposed by the government for such commodities where there is a lot of substitutes, then the burden is actually shared, mostly shared by the producers. As you can see, it would be an elastic demanded product, and the producer would be sharing major proportion of the tax burden, and consumers would be sharing a much lower tax burden. So this is the difference between an inelastic demand and elastic demand when it comes to tax incidence. So as you can see, the burden is shared differently when the elasticity of demand changes. Now, what happens when the elasticity of supply changes for inelastic supply and elastic supply? Let's look at that in our next video.